The rain had been falling for 42 days when Private Thomas Gillen first saw the mist that should not exist. October 1917. The Third Battle of Ypres ground forward through Belgian mud thick enough to drown a man standing upright. Passchendaele Ridge rose before the Allied forces like a broken tooth against a sky the color of old iron. Gillen crouched in a shell crater half filled with water that smelled of cordite and worse things, his rifle clutched against his chest, watching the dawn break over a landscape that resembled nothing so much as the surface of a dead planet. The bombardment had stopped an hour before. In the terrible silence that followed, men whispered prayers or said nothing at all. The mist came with the first light. It rolled across no man's land from the German positions, low and black as oil smoke, moving against the wind. Gillen watched it approach with the numb fascination of a man who has seen too much death to fear one more impossible thing. Beside him, Corporal James Wetherell from Yorkshire made a sound low in his throat. They had served together since the Somme. Wetherell knew the difference between morning fog and something else. The mist reached their crater at 0600 hours. It poured over the lip like thick water, and the moment it touched Gillen's skin, the world changed. The mud beneath his boots became a carpet of yellow flowers. The shattered stumps of trees sprouted leaves of brilliant copper. The sky opened up into a dome of glass through which he could see stars burning in configurations he had never learned. Wetherell was screaming, but Gillen could hear the sound only distantly, as though his friend stood at the far end of a long tunnel. He raised his hand before his face and watched his fingers multiply into 7, then 12, then collapse back into 5. The hallucination lasted 90 seconds, according to his watch, though it felt like hours. When the mist passed, Gillen found himself standing waist-deep in the crater water with his rifle aimed at nothing. Wetherell lay unconscious on the muddy slope. 3 other men from their section were visible in nearby craters, all exhibiting signs of profound disorientation. One was laughing with tears streaming down his face. Another had removed his helmet and was methodically filling it with mud. By noon, the casualty reports began filtering back through the division. The phenomenon had affected approximately 3,000 men across a frontage of 2 miles. No deaths directly attributed to the mist itself, but 17 men had walked into German machine gun fire while hallucinating. 23 had drowned in shell craters. 41 were being evacuated for psychiatric evaluation. The official reports called it gas exposure, though every man who experienced it knew the difference between chlorine or phosgene and whatever had come across no man's land that morning. Captain Edward Lattimore of the Royal Army Medical Corps received his first cases at the field hospital behind Zonnebeke at 1400 hours. He was 36 years old, a neurologist from Edinburgh who had volunteered in 1914 with romantic notions about service and sacrifice. 3 years of treating shrapnel wounds and gas gangrene had cured him of romance. The men carried in on stretchers that afternoon presented symptoms unlike anything in his experience. Private Daniel Fawcett from Cornwall described watching his hands transform into birds and fly away from his wrists. Lance Corporal Peter Drummond from Glasgow reported seeing his dead brother standing in the trench beside him, speaking in a language Drummond could almost but not quite understand. Sergeant William Thorne insisted with complete conviction that he had been transported to his childhood home in Devon and had eaten breakfast with his mother, who had been dead for 11 years. The level of detail in these accounts disturbed Lattimore more than the hallucinations themselves. These were not the rambling delusions of shell shock victims. The men described impossible experiences with perfect clarity and coherence. Lattimore compiled his observations into a report that evening. He noted the geographical concentration of cases, the precise timing of onset, the consistent duration of symptoms. He requested permission to interview additional witnesses and conduct neurological examinations. His superior officer, Colonel Hugh Brennan, read the report and immediately classified it as restricted. Brennan was a career military physician who had served in India and South Africa. He understood the importance of morale and the danger of unexplained phenomena spreading through the ranks like contagion. The official explanation was established within 18 hours. Gas attack, Chlorine-based, unusual atmospheric conditions caused unexpected dispersal patterns. The affected men were suffering from acute exposure combined with combat fatigue. No further investigation necessary. Case closed. But the mist returned on the morning of October 9th. This time it appeared during a British advance on the village of Poel Capelle. The 4th Battalion of the Coldstream Guards was moving forward through a communication trench when the black vapor rolled over them from the southeast. Lieutenant Marcus Aldworth, leading the advance platoon, later described the experience in testimony that would never appear in official records. The trench walls became transparent as glass. He could see through the earth into vast chambers filled with machinery that hummed and clicked with purposeful rhythm. His men transformed into figures made of light that left trails of color as they moved. The German positions ahead resolved into a city of brass towers that stretched upward into infinity. When the mist cleared, Aldworth discovered he had led his platoon in a complete circle back to their starting position. 6 men were missing. They were found 3 hours later, wandering in the ruins of a farmhouse 400 yards behind British lines. None could explain how they had gotten there. One insisted he had never left the trench. Another claimed he had been walking through the mist for days, though his watch showed only 8 minutes had elapsed. The pattern repeated itself 9 times over the next 12 days. The mist appeared without warning, always in different sectors, always during daylight hours. It showed no respect for wind direction or weather conditions. Sometimes it lasted less than a minute. Other times it persisted for nearly 10 minutes, though never longer. The affected areas varied in size from a few hundred square yards to over half a mile. Estimates of total affected personnel ranged from 8,000 to 12,000 men on the British side alone. German casualties from the phenomenon were unknown, though prisoners taken after October 15th exhibited the same symptoms and told similar stories. Medical officers across the Ypres salient struggled to contain what was rapidly becoming a crisis of confidence. Men began refusing to leave their dugouts during dawn hours when the mist most frequently appeared. Superstitions proliferated. Some believed the mist was poison gas manufactured from the bodies of the dead. Others claimed it was a German secret weapon, an application of science so advanced it might as well be witchcraft. A chaplain attached to the 37th Division reported that Catholic soldiers were requesting exorcisms, convinced they had been touched by demonic forces. On October the 17th, Captain Lattimore received orders to report to a farmhouse 3 miles behind the lines. He arrived at dusk to find a staff car parked in the yard and a security detail from the military police guarding the entrance. Inside, he met a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Craven, a civilian attached to an unnamed ministry in London. Craven was perhaps 50 years old, lean and grey, with the perpetually preoccupied expression of someone performing complex calculations in his head. He wore a suit that had been expensive before the mud of Flanders ruined it and carried a leather case chained to his wrist. Craven wanted to know everything. He questioned Lattimore for 3 hours, taking notes in a shorthand system the captain did not recognize. He was particularly interested in the temporal aspects of the hallucinations. How long did they last? Did all affected men experience the same duration? Were there variations based on proximity to the mist's apparent center? Lattimore answered as best he could, but found himself disturbed by the nature and specificity of the questions. Craven was not investigating an unknown phenomenon. He was confirming something he already suspected. When Lattimore asked directly what the government knew about the mist, Craven's expression did not change. He closed his notebook, lit a cigarette, and stared at the captain for nearly 30 seconds before speaking. What he said then would trouble Lattimore for the rest of his life, which ended in 1943 when a German bomb struck his London flat during the Blitz. There were certain places, Craven explained, where the fabric of normal reality grew thin. War accelerated the process. The concentration of death, suffering, and intense human emotion in a small geographical area created conditions that were, in his careful phrasing, conducive to unusual manifestations. Passchendaele was not the first such location. There had been incidents during the Gallipoli campaign. Earlier reports from Verdun. isolated cases going back to the Crimean War, and perhaps further. The ministry for which Craven worked had been documenting these occurrences for longer than Lattimore might imagine. The captain asked what caused the mist itself. Craven's answer was precise and entirely unhelpful. The current working theory suggested it was not gas or any chemical agent. Atmospheric analysis of affected areas showed nothing unusual. Soil samples revealed no foreign substances. The mist appeared to be ordinary fog, indistinguishable from the morning mists that rose from the Flanders lowlands every autumn. The hallucinations were not caused by the mist touching the men. They were caused by the men entering geographical zones where certain natural laws operated differently than expected. Lattimore asked if this was some form of mass hysteria. Craven laughed without humor. He opened his leather case and removed a photograph. It showed a section of trench wall, the sandbags clearly visible in the foreground. In the background, barely visible through what appeared to be black fog, stood a structure. It resembled a tower or obelisk, composed of some dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The geometry was wrong in ways Lattimore could not immediately articulate. Angles met in configurations that should not be possible in three-dimensional space. The photograph had been taken on October the 12th by a soldier who had the presence of mind to use his camera during a mist episode. The camera was a vest pocket Kodak, standard issue for officers who could afford them. The soldier claimed he had photographed nothing but empty trench and fog. Yet when the film was developed, the structure appeared. Craven had 17 similar photographs, all showing variations of the same impossible architecture emerging from the mist. Mass hysteria, Craven observed, did not leave physical evidence on photographic plates. Lattimore sat in silence, absorbing implications that rewrote his understanding of reality. He asked the question that any rational man would ask under such circumstances. What were they supposed to do about it? Craven's response was brief and crushingly practical. Nothing. The phenomenon would run its course. The mist would eventually stop appearing, as it had in previous locations after the intensity of combat diminished. In the meantime, affected soldiers would receive standard treatment for combat fatigue. Reports would be suppressed or explained away. The war would continue. The captain returned to his hospital that night, carrying knowledge he could never share. Over the following weeks, he treated hundreds of men who had encountered the black mist, as soldiers were beginning to call it. He documented their experiences in private journals that he kept locked in a metal box. He noted patterns that should not exist. Multiple men from different units, who had never spoken to each other, described seeing identical structures in the mist. The brass towers Lieutenant Aldworth reported appeared in the accounts of at least 30 other men. A cathedral made of bones and glass featured in over 50 testimonies. Something that witnesses struggled to describe, but referred to consistently as the mechanism appeared in countless reports, always accompanied by the same detail. It was counting something, though none could say what or why. The Battle of Passchendaele concluded on November the 10th, 1917. Canadian forces captured the village ruins at tremendous cost. Over 300,000 casualties on both sides for an advance that measured less than 5 miles. The strategic value was debatable. The psychological cost was incalculable. And somewhere in the midst of that industrial horror, thousands of men had briefly touched something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. The black mist stopped appearing after the battle ended. Captain Lattimore continued to treat survivors for years after the war. Many of the men who had experienced the hallucinations reported persistent effects. Vivid dreams featuring the same impossible architecture they had seen in the mist. Moments of temporal dislocation where they experienced brief but intense sensations of being in two places simultaneously. A handful developed extraordinary capabilities that defied medical explanation. Private Gillen, the soldier who had first reported the phenomenon, discovered he could predict with uncanny accuracy when it would rain, sometimes days in advance. Lance Corporal Drummond began experiencing what could only be described as premonitions, though he could never act on them in time to prevent the events he foresaw. The government files on the Black Mist, compiled by Craven and others like him, were sealed under the Official Secrets Act. They remained classified long after everyone involved was dead. Lattimore's journals disappeared from his estate after his death. His family assumed they had been lost in the bombing. More likely, they were confiscated by the same ministry that had sent Craven to Flanders 3 decades earlier. What remained were stories. Veterans who spoke carefully about that autumn in Belgium, choosing their words with precision, aware that certain experiences could not be adequately conveyed to those who had not been there. Researchers who noticed statistical anomalies in the medical records from Passchendaele, clusters of psychiatric cases that defied conventional explanation. Historians who found gaps in official documentation, redactions that suggested something more than routine military censorship. The earth around Passchendaele holds its secrets well. The village was rebuilt after the war. Farmers returned to their fields. The shell craters filled with water and became ponds where cattle drink. Memorial stones mark where men died by the thousands. Tourists walk the preserved trenches and try to imagine what occurred here. But there are no monuments to the Black Mist, no plaques explaining what happened to the men who walked through that dark vapor and came back changed. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. The archive room into the basement of the Imperial War Museum smelled of old paper and institutional neglect. Dr. Helena Voss spent 3 weeks searching through boxes before she found the first reference to what soldiers had called the Black Mist. It appeared in a footnote of a medical report dated December 1917, written by a physician whose name had been redacted. The footnote mentioned unusual psychological presentations among casualties from the Ypres salient, then directed readers to supplementary documentation that did not appear to exist. Voss was 31 years old in 1953, a historian specializing in the psychological impact of industrial warfare. She had come looking for material on shell-shock treatment protocols. What she found instead was evidence of systematic suppression. The British government had spent 36 years ensuring that certain stories stayed buried. But bureaucracies are imperfect machines, and information leaks through cracks. A misfiled report here, an uncensored letter there. The testimony of men who refused to forget. Voss began assembling fragments, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a picture of something the official histories refused to acknowledge. She worked alone, aware that her funding could disappear if her research took directions her sponsors considered inappropriate. The post-war academic establishment preferred clean narratives about courage and sacrifice. Unexplained mass hallucinations complicated the story. She found Private Thomas Gillen in a veterans' hospital in Manchester. He was 58 years old, his lungs ruined by gas exposure, his hands shaking from what doctors called essential tremor. But what Gillen knew was something else entirely. He had not spoken about the Black Mist to anyone outside his immediate family since 1918. When Voss introduced herself and explained her research, he stared at her for nearly a minute before speaking. His first question was whether she believed him, not whether she believed in the mist's existence, but whether she believed his specific experience of it. The distinction mattered to him. 36 years of people nodding sympathetically while clearly thinking he was damaged had taught him to recognize genuine interest. Voss spent 2 days interviewing Gillen. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, frequently pausing to ensure he was communicating precisely what he remembered, rather than what subsequent years might have added or distorted. The flowers in the mud had been yellow, specifically the yellow of wild mustard. The copper leaves had moved in a breeze he could not feel. The stars visible through the glass sky had formed patterns that reminded him of mathematical diagrams, though he had never studied mathematics beyond basic arithmetic. These details had remained consistent across decades. He had never embellished them, never added dramatic flourishes. The memory sat in his mind like a foreign object, perfectly preserved, refusing to integrate with his other experiences of the war. He told Voss about the other men. Wetherell had died in 1937, his heart giving out while he worked in a textile mill. Before his death, he had confided to Gillen that he still dreamed about the mist weekly, always the same dream where he walked through black vapor that whispered in a language just beyond comprehension. Daniel Fawcett, the Cornish private who had watched his hands become birds, had returned home to find he could no longer touch certain objects without experiencing overwhelming sensory distortions. Metal felt hot regardless of actual temperature. Wood seemed to pulse with internal rhythms. He had adapted by wearing gloves constantly, even in summer, a habit his family found eccentric but accepted. Gillen provided Voss with names, addresses when he had them, military service numbers that would help track down other survivors. She left Manchester with a list of 43 men to locate and interview. Over the following 18 months, she found 31 of them. 12 had died. Of the 19 she successfully interviewed, 16 were willing to discuss their experiences. 3 refused, becoming agitated at the mere mention of Passchendaele. The consistency of their accounts troubled her more than any contradictions would have. Scientific training had taught Voss to be skeptical of perfect agreement among witnesses. Human memory was malleable, suggestible, prone to contamination from external sources. Yet these men, who had not communicated with each other in decades, described identical impossible things. The brass towers, the bone cathedral, the mechanism that counted in the darkness. Either they had experienced something genuinely anomalous, or they had collectively confabulated the same hallucinations through some process psychology could not yet explain. She found references to Mr. Craven in military correspondence from 1917. His name appeared without context or explanation, always in connection with incidents officially attributed to gas exposure or combat fatigue. A notation in an intelligence summary mentioned his affiliation with something called the Special Phenomena Unit, but no such unit existed in any organizational chart Voss could access. She wrote letters to the War Office requesting information. The responses were polite and unhelpful. Records had been lost. Personnel files were restricted. Perhaps she should focus her research on more productive avenues. The stonewalling confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The black mist was not merely an unexplained event that had been forgotten. It was an explained event whose explanation remained classified. In March 1955, Voss received a visitor at her office in London. He introduced himself as Edmund Harker, a civil servant with an interest in her work. He was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in the anonymous style of career bureaucrats, carrying a briefcase worn smooth by decades of use. His manner was cordial and completely impersonal. He understood she had been investigating unusual medical reports from the Great War. Fascinating subject, rich historical material, potential for valuable insights into the treatment of psychological trauma. However, certain aspects of her research touched upon matters that remained protected under the Official Secrets Act. Perhaps she could redirect her focus slightly, avoid certain specific incidents, while still producing meaningful scholarship. Voss asked if he was threatening her. Harker smiled without warmth. He was offering guidance, nothing more. The government took its security obligations seriously. Researchers who persisted in investigating restricted subjects sometimes found their access to archives revoked. Funding became difficult to obtain. Academic positions grew scarce. These were simply unfortunate consequences of working in sensitive areas. She asked what made events from 38 years ago still sensitive. Harker's expression did not change. Some questions, he observed, contained their own answers. Then he stood, wished her well in her future endeavors, and departed. Voss sat alone in her office for an hour afterward, weighing consequences against curiosity. She was aware that continuing her research would damage her career. She was equally aware that abandoning it would be an act of intellectual cowardice she could not accept. She found Captain Edward Lattimore's daughter in Edinburgh. Margaret Lattimore was 43 years old, a schoolteacher, her father's only child. She had been 9 when he returned from France, old enough to remember the change in him. The cheerful, energetic man who had left in 1914 came back quiet and preoccupied, prone to long silences where he stared at nothing. He had been a good father despite the distance in him. He had attended school events, helped with homework, provided everything the family needed. But some essential part of him had remained in Flanders, and they all knew it, even if they could not name what had been lost. Margaret told Voss about her father's journals. He had kept them locked in his desk, had never discussed their contents with anyone. After his death in 1943, Margaret had found the metal box while settling his estate. She had read enough to understand these were not ordinary case notes. The descriptions were too strange, too detailed, recorded with a precision that suggested her father considered them vitally important. She had kept the journals hidden from authorities, some instinct warning her that official channels would make them disappear. Voss spent a week reading Lattimore's meticulous documentation. The captain had been more than a physician recording symptoms. He had been a scientist observing a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. His notes included diagrams of the structures men described seeing in the mist, sketched from witness descriptions. The brass towers appeared repeatedly, their proportions consistent across multiple accounts. He had calculated angles, noted that certain aspects of the architecture violated Euclidean geometry in specific measurable ways. He had interviewed men about the temporal distortions they experienced, documenting discrepancies between subjective time and clock time that ranged from negligible to impossible. One section of the journals focused on what Lattimore called persistent effects. He had tracked affected soldiers for years after the war, noting changes that seemed connected to their exposure to the black mist. Enhanced sensory perception appeared frequently. Men reported being able to smell rain hours before it arrived, sense changes in barometric pressure, detect emotional states in others through means they could not articulate. Some developed what could only be termed precognitive abilities, though Lattimore was careful never to use that word. He described instead a capacity for accurate prediction that exceeded statistical probability, a sensitivity to imminent events that manifested as physical sensations or intrusive thoughts. The final entry in the journals was dated June 1943, 2 weeks before Lattimore's death. He had written it after encountering a patient at the hospital where he practiced, a young RAF pilot being treated for injuries sustained when his fighter was shot down over the channel. The pilot had described his experience of combat in terms that struck Lattimore as familiar. The moment before his plane was hit, he had experienced a temporal distortion where everything slowed, and he could see trajectories of bullets not yet fired. The sensation lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like minutes. He had taken evasive action based on information he should not have possessed. Lattimore had questioned him carefully. The pilot had never been to Passchendaele, had been 4 years old when that battle occurred. But he had flown missions over the Ruhr Valley during the early bombing campaigns, had survived encounters that killed more experienced pilots through what he described as impossible luck. Lattimore's final journal entry consisted of a single question written in capital letters. Is it spreading? Voss closed the journal and sat in Margaret Lattimore's kitchen while afternoon light faded through the windows. She understood she was assembling pieces of something larger and more disturbing than she had initially imagined. The black mist was not an isolated anomaly, a strange footnote in the history of the Great War. It was evidence of something ongoing, something that touched lives decades after the trenches had been filled in and the barbed wire removed. She began searching for patterns in other conflicts. Documented cases of unexplained psychological symptoms among combat troops appeared with surprising frequency once she knew what to look for. Reports from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 mentioned soldiers experiencing shared hallucinations during the siege of Port Arthur. Spanish Civil War medical records included references to temporal distortions affecting Republican forces during the defense of Madrid. Even in the ongoing conflict in Korea, field reports occasionally mentioned phenomena that did not fit standard categories of combat stress. The connections were subtle, easily dismissed as coincidence or misdiagnosis. But the underlying pattern remained consistent. Wherever military forces engaged in sustained, intensive combat within geographically confined areas, a small percentage of personnel developed symptoms identical to those observed at Passchendaele. Mass hallucinations featuring impossible architecture. Temporal distortions, persistent psychological and perceptual changes lasting years after exposure. The official explanations varied. Gas exposure, shell shock, combat fatigue, but the underlying reality refused to conform to official narratives. In July 1956, Voss received a package with no return address. Inside was a folder containing photocopies of documents she had never seen. Military intelligence reports from 1917 and 1918, marked with security classifications that should have ensured their permanent suppression. Memoranda discussing the establishment of observation protocols for monitoring affected personnel. A budget allocation for a special research unit whose name and function were redacted. And at the bottom of the stack, a single photograph. It showed the structure that appeared in the image Craven had shown Captain Lattimore. The dark tower or obelisk that absorbed light, its geometry wrong in ways that made the eye slide away from direct observation. But this photograph was different. It had been taken in daylight, in a location that was clearly not the Western Front. The terrain was rocky, mountainous. In the background, barely visible, was writing on a damaged sign. Voss obtained a magnifying glass and studied the letters carefully. Russian Cyrillic characters, enough to make out a location, Tsaritsyn, the city that would later be renamed Stalingrad. The photograph was dated 1919, during the Russian Civil War. Voss understood then what she was truly investigating. The black mist was not specific to Passchendaele or even to the Great War. It was a manifestation of something that occurred wherever humans concentrated violence and death in sufficient density. The trenches of Flanders had simply provided optimal conditions, like a laboratory experiment accidentally reproducing natural phenomena at observable scale. Whatever thin places in reality Captain Lattimore's mysterious contact had described, they were not isolated anomalies. They were consequences of war itself, predictable and reproducible. She spent 3 months writing a manuscript that compiled her research into a comprehensive account. She documented witness testimonies, analyzed medical records, traced patterns across multiple conflicts and geographical regions. She presented evidence carefully, avoiding sensational claims, letting the accumulation of data speak for itself. The result was a work of rigorous historical scholarship that happened to describe events outside the accepted boundaries of possibility. No publisher would touch it. University presses rejected it as insufficiently academic. Commercial publishers dismissed it as too academic. The few editors willing to discuss the manuscript privately admitted they found it disturbing and credible, which was precisely why they could not publish it. Books describing impossible things as historical fact created legal and professional liabilities no one wanted to assume. Voss deposited the manuscript with the Imperial War Museum archives in 1957, along with copies of all supporting documentation she had gathered. She included a note stating that the material should be made available to researchers after a period of 50 years. Museum administrators accepted the donation, catalogued it, and filed it in storage, where it would remain untouched for decades. She continued teaching, publishing conventional scholarship, maintaining the appearance of an academic career focused on acceptable subjects. But she maintained contact with the veterans she had interviewed, writing letters, visiting when possible. Private Gillen died in 1961. Before his death, he told Voss that he had never regretted entering the mist, despite everything that followed. It had shown him that reality was larger and stranger than anyone admitted. That knowledge was a burden, but also a kind of gift. He had spent decades as a laborer in textile mills, unremarkable and easily overlooked, but he carried inside him the memory of walking through impossible spaces and surviving. The bone cathedral Peter Drummond described had walls made of human skeletal remains fused together into organic architecture. The bones were not stacked or arranged but grown, as though the structure had emerged from some biological process that used calcium and marrow as construction material. The ceiling rose into darkness that felt infinite. Light came from sources he could not identify, a cold blue radiance that cast no shadows. In the center of the cathedral stood what he termed an altar, though it resembled no religious object he recognized. It was geometric and crystalline, rotating slowly through dimensions he could perceive but not count. Sergeant William Thorne had watched the mechanism work. He described it as vast, mechanical, and utterly purposeful. Gears the size of houses turned with precision. Pistons larger than locomotives drove in and out of cylinders that extended beyond visibility. The entire assembly produced a sound like music, if music could be mathematics made audible. He understood in the moments he observed it that the mechanism was counting. Not numbers as humans used them, but events. Moments when possibilities collapsed into actualities. Instances of death or birth or transformation. It was keeping score of something, maintaining a tally whose purpose he could not begin to guess. These descriptions appeared in Lattimore's journals, recorded with clinical precision. Voss had read them dozens of times, trying to extract meaning from experiences that defied interpretation. Were they genuine perceptions of actual structures existing in dimensions beyond normal human access? Were they symbolic representations generated by minds under extreme stress, attempting to process incomprehensible stimuli? The question remained unanswerable, but the consistency of the reports suggested they were not random hallucinations. By 1965, most of the men Voss had interviewed were dead. The black mist became a memory preserved only in restricted archives and unpublished manuscripts. The Second World War had produced its own anomalies, instances of unexplained phenomena occurring in bombed cities and besieged fortresses, but these were similarly suppressed or explained away. The institutions responsible for maintaining official reality had refined their techniques. Information control had become more sophisticated, more effective at ensuring certain stories never achieved mainstream acknowledgement. Voss retired from teaching in 1973. Her reputation solid, if unspectacular. She had published 3 books on conventional military medical history, had supervised doctoral students, had served on academic committees. Her colleagues considered her a competent scholar who had produced respectable work without achieving particular distinction. None knew about the manuscript gathering dust in museum archives, the interviews conducted in veterans' hospitals and council flats, the years spent documenting something that officially never happened. She died in 1986, 2 weeks before her 64th birthday. Her obituary in the Times ran 3 sentences, noting her contributions to historical scholarship and listing her published works. There was no mention of her research into the Black Mist, no acknowledgement of the hundreds of hours spent listening to old soldiers describe impossible experiences. History had absorbed her efforts and rendered them invisible, as it does with most attempts to document uncomfortable truths. The veterans who had walked through that dark vapor were gone. The physicians who had treated them were gone. The bureaucrats who had suppressed evidence of what occurred were gone. What remained were fragments scattered across archives and private collections, pieces of a story no one was assembling because no one knew it existed. The official history of Passchendaele mentioned courage and sacrifice and strategic miscalculation. It said nothing about doors opening into spaces that should not exist, or men returning from those spaces permanently changed. Some truths are too strange for history books. They persist instead in marginal spaces, passed between people willing to believe that reality contains more than authorities acknowledge. The Black Mist became one of those truths, a story told by researchers investigating the boundaries between documented fact and suppressed knowledge. And in those spaces, the question Captain Lattimore posed in his final journal entry echoed unanswered. Was it spreading? The file arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1998, delivered by courier to a flat in Bloomsbury, where nobody expected it. Professor Andrew Mackenzie had spent 20 years researching anomalous psychological phenomena in military contexts. He was 52 years old, tenured at King's College London, respected within a narrow academic specialty that most scholars avoided as career suicide. His work focused on documented cases of mass hallucination, collective delusion, and perceptual distortions affecting military personnel under extreme stress. The file came from an anonymous source who had somehow obtained his private address rather than his university office. Inside was a copy of Helena Voss's unpublished manuscript, along with supporting documentation she had compiled 4 decades earlier. Mackenzie read through the night. By dawn, he understood he was holding evidence of systematic suppression spanning 8 decades. The Black Mist was not merely an unexplained incident from the Great War. It was a recurring phenomenon that militaries and governments had been monitoring, documenting, and concealing since at least 1917. Voss had assembled pieces of the puzzle, but she had been working in the 1950s with limited access to international sources and Cold War restrictions on information sharing. Mackenzie had resources she had lacked. Digital archives were emerging. Soviet records were becoming accessible following the collapse of the USSR. Veterans of more recent conflicts were still alive and willing to talk. He began with the Russian Civil War photograph Voss had received. The image showed the impossible structure near Tsaritsyn during 1919. Mackenzie contacted colleagues in Moscow who had access to military archives from that period. What they found was troubling. Medical records from the 10th Army defending Tsaritsyn against white forces included references to mass psychological casualties occurring in August and September 1919. Approximately 2,000 soldiers reported experiencing shared hallucinations during intense fighting in the factory districts. The symptoms matched those observed at Passchendaele almost exactly. Temporal distortions, visions of impossible architecture, persistent perceptual changes lasting years after the event. The Soviet military had responded differently than the British. Rather than suppressing information, they had attempted to weaponize it. Documents from the 1920s revealed research programs investigating whether the psychological effects could be deliberately induced in enemy forces. The research apparently failed or was abandoned. References to it disappeared from official records after 1927, though budgetary allocations for unspecified psychological research continued through the Stalin era. Mackenzie found similar patterns in German military records captured after the Second World War. Wehrmacht medical officers had documented cases of mass hallucination affecting units engaged in sustained urban combat during the Battle of Stalingrad. The German accounts described the same brass towers, the same bone cathedral, the same impossible mechanism that British soldiers had reported at Passchendaele 25 years earlier. SS intelligence units had investigated, producing reports that were immediately classified at the highest levels. Hitler himself had apparently been briefed, though the content of that briefing remained unknown. The consistency across national boundaries and ideological systems was significant. British, Russian, and German forces had independently documented identical phenomena while fighting separate wars in different decades. Either the same mass delusion was spontaneously generating across cultures and languages, or the experiences represented genuine encounters with something existing outside normal perception. Mackenzie traveled to Belgium in October 1998. He spent 2 weeks in the Ypres region, walking the former battlefield, visiting the rebuilt village of Passchendaele, interviewing local residents whose grandparents had witnessed the battle. The land had long since healed its visible scars. Productive farmland covered what had been a desolate wasteland of mud and shell craters. But stories persisted. Old families in the area spoke carefully about certain fields where animals refused to graze. Sections of forest that grew differently, the trees twisted in subtle ways that might be natural variation or might indicate something else. A farmer named Luc de Vries took Mackenzie to a field 3 kilometers south of Passchendaele village. The field was rectangular, perhaps 6 hectares, bordered by hedgerows that marked old property boundaries. Nothing obviously unusual about it. The soil was rich, the wheat crop healthy. But de Vries explained that his grandfather had refused to cultivate this particular field for 15 years after the war ended. The old man claimed the ground was wrong, though he could never articulate what he meant. Animals turned loose in the field would gather at the edges rather than graze the center. Birds avoided flying over it, instead circling around to reach destinations on the far side. De Vries himself had noticed peculiarities. Compasses behaved erratically in the field's center, needles spinning slowly rather than pointing north. Electronic equipment occasionally malfunctioned, batteries draining faster than they should. During heavy fog, which was common in autumn, the mist in this field sometimes appeared darker than surrounding areas, though the effect could be attributed to lighting conditions. Local teenagers told stories about the field, daring each other to spend nights there, claiming that strange sounds could be heard after midnight. DeVries dismissed most of this as folklore, but he acknowledged that the field felt different in ways he could not explain. Mackenzie spent 3 nights camping in the field with monitoring equipment. He recorded ambient electromagnetic readings, temperature variations, barometric pressure changes. Nothing exceeded normal parameters. On the second night, heavy fog rolled in from the west around 0300 hours. He sat in his tent, watching the mist thicken until visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. The darkness seemed absolute, deeper than ordinary night. He experienced no hallucinations, no temporal distortions, none of the dramatic effects reported by soldiers in 1917. But he felt what he later described as a pressure, not physical but psychological, a sense of presence without source or direction. The feeling lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When the fog began to lift around 0430, the pressure dissipated. Mackenzie emerged from his tent to find his equipment functioning normally, all readings within expected ranges. Yet something had occurred that his instruments could not measure. He was certain of that with the same conviction he felt about basic facts of his own existence. The field contained something, a residue or echo of whatever had manifested here 81 years earlier. It was faint, barely perceptible, but present. He returned to London and began searching for other locations. If Passchendaele retained traces of the phenomenon decades later, other sites might as well. He compiled a list of battlefields where intense, sustained combat had occurred within geographically confined areas. Verdun, in France, where fighting lasted 10 months and produced over 700,000 casualties. The Somme, scene of the British Army's bloodiest single day. Stalingrad, where the Wehrmacht and Red Army destroyed an entire city while fighting building to building. Hue City in Vietnam, where U.S. Marines and North Vietnamese forces battled through urban terrain for nearly a month. Archives from Verdun contained references to psychological casualties that matched the Passchendaele pattern. French medical officers in 1916 had documented cases of mass hallucination affecting troops in the Fort Vaux sector. The descriptions were fragmentary, much of the documentation lost or destroyed during subsequent German offensives, but enough remained to establish the presence of unexplained phenomena. Soldiers had reported seeing structures that could not exist, experiencing time moving at incorrect rates, hearing sounds that had no physical source. The French army had attributed the symptoms to stress, exhaustion, and the unique horrors of subterranean fortress warfare. American records from Vietnam were more detailed. Marine Corps after-action reports from the Battle of Hue included appendices noting unusual psychological casualties during the fighting's second week. Multiple Marines reported experiencing what they described as time slips, brief moments where they perceived events before they occurred or after they had already happened. Several claimed to have seen architecture that was not Vietnamese or French colonial, structures composed of materials and geometries that should not exist in physical space. Military psychiatrists had evaluated affected personnel, diagnosed them with acute combat stress reaction, and evacuated them to rear areas for treatment. Mackenzie obtained contact information for 3 Marines who had been in Hue during February 1968. 2 agreed to interviews. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reeves, retired, living in North Carolina, described the experience with precision that suggested decades of careful memory preservation. His platoon had been clearing a building in the Citadel's southwest corner when something happened. The air became thick, difficult to breathe though there was no gas or smoke. The walls of the building became transparent, revealing spaces behind them that were larger than the building's exterior dimensions allowed. He saw machinery, vast and purposeful, operating with the same precision Sergeant William Thorne had described at Passchendaele 51 years earlier. The effect lasted less than 5 minutes. When it passed, Reeves found himself separated from his squad, standing in a courtyard he did not recognize. His radio did not function. His watch had stopped at 09:23, though he could not remember what time the phenomenon had begun. He spent 40 minutes finding his way back to friendly positions, during which time his squad had reported him missing. According to their account, he had vanished while moving through a doorway and reappeared from a different building entirely. None could explain how he had gotten from one location to the other without passing through areas under enemy observation. Corporal David Brennan had a different experience. His squad encountered what he could only describe as fog, though the weather was clear and hot. The fog was dark, almost black, smelling of something organic and rotten. It rolled down the street toward them, moving against the wind. When it touched him, Brennan experienced a complete temporal displacement. He was no longer in hue, but in a landscape of glass and metal, where towers rose into a sky that was not sky but some kind of membrane separating realities. He could see through the membrane into other places, other times. Images overlapped and interpenetrated, creating a visual experience that hurt to perceive. The displacement ended abruptly. Brennan collapsed, was evacuated by his squad, and spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric ward before being cleared for duty. He never spoke about the experience officially, aware that detailed descriptions would extend his psychiatric evaluation indefinitely. But the memory remained absolutely clear, more vivid than any ordinary experience of combat. He had touched something that existed outside normal space-time, something that wars somehow made temporarily accessible. Mackenzie compiled these accounts with hundreds of others, building a database of reported phenomena across multiple conflicts and geographical regions. Patterns emerged. The hallucinations occurred almost exclusively in areas where combat had been particularly intense and sustained. Urban warfare seemed to produce stronger effects than open-field battles. Subterranean combat, in tunnels or fortifications, showed the highest incidence rates. The phenomena appeared to be cumulative, intensifying with increased casualties and destruction within confined spaces. He developed a hypothesis. Human consciousness, particularly consciousness experiencing extreme stress and imminent death, interacted with physical reality in measurable but poorly understood ways. When thousands of people simultaneously experienced terror, rage, and mortal fear in a small geographical area, they created conditions analogous to intense electromagnetic fields. These fields did not consist of conventional energy, but of something more fundamental, a distortion in the underlying structure that physics assumed was constant. Wars created tears in the fabric of normal reality, and through those tears, other spaces became briefly accessible. The hypothesis was untestable through conventional scientific methodology. No ethics committee would approve experiments requiring subjects to experience mortal terror in controlled conditions. No funding agency would support research investigating phenomena that violated fundamental physical principles. Mackenzie was proposing that consciousness itself was a force capable of altering space-time geometry, and that wars were the larger-scale consciousness experiments humans inadvertently conducted. The implications were profound and completely unprovable. He presented his research at a conference on military psychology in Stockholm during March 1999. The response was mixed. Colleagues acknowledged the quality of his historical documentation while dismissing his theoretical framework as speculation without empirical support. Several attendees suggested privately that he was damaging his reputation by associating rigorous historical work with metaphysical claims. The conference organizers politely declined to publish his paper in the proceedings volume. 3 weeks later, Mackenzie received a visitor at his university office. The man introduced himself as Jonathan Crane, a researcher with the Ministry of Defense. He was perhaps 40 years old, professionally neutral in manner and appearance, carrying credentials that checked out when Mackenzie verified them later. Crane had attended the Stockholm conference, had found Mackenzie's presentation fascinating and wanted to discuss possibilities for collaborative research. The ministry had been conducting its own investigations into anomalous battlefield phenomena. Perhaps their resources and Mackenzie's expertise could be mutually beneficial. Mackenzie asked what kind of investigations. Crane's answer was carefully nonspecific. The ministry maintained records of unusual incidents reported by British forces across multiple conflicts. These records were not publicly accessible due to security classifications, but under appropriate circumstances, qualified researchers could be granted limited access. The ministry was particularly interested in developing predictive models for identifying battlefield conditions likely to produce psychological casualties. If Mackenzie's hypothesis had merit, it might enable military planners to avoid situations where troops would be exposed to potentially destabilizing phenomena. The professor understood he was being recruited. Crane represented the same institutional apparatus that had suppressed information about the Black Mist for 8 decades. They were offering access in exchange for control over what he discovered and how he communicated it. Academic freedom would be replaced by security protocols and publication restrictions. His research would continue, but on terms dictated by organizations whose primary interest was operational advantage rather than knowledge for its own sake. He declined Crane's offer. The researcher accepted the rejection with professional courtesy, thanked Mackenzie for his time, and departed. 2 months later, Mackenzie's application for a research grant was denied, despite strong peer reviews. His request to access certain military archives was rejected on security grounds. A journal that had previously expressed interest in publishing his work informed him they could no longer proceed with the article. The pattern was clear and unsurprising. He had been warned. Mackenzie continued his research independently, publishing in marginal venues, presenting at smaller conferences, building a network of scholars investigating similar phenomena. The work was professionally isolated but intellectually rewarding. He documented dozens of additional cases, refined his theoretical models, and gradually assembled what amounted to an alternative history of 20th century warfare. Not the history of strategies and casualties and territorial gains, but the history of tiers in reality that conflict created and the things that move through those tiers. In October 2003, he returned to Belgium. It was 86 years since the Black Mist had first appeared over Passchendaele Ridge. He stood in Luc de Vries' field under autumn rain, mud sucking at his boots, watching fog roll across landscape that had absorbed more human suffering than most places on Earth. He thought about the men who had walked through black vapor and returned changed, about the structures they had seen and the knowledge they carried until death. He thought about governments spending a century suppressing evidence that reality was more complex and stranger than official narratives acknowledged. The rain fell harder. Lightning flickered in clouds to the west. And for just a moment, no more than 3 or 4 seconds, the air in front of him darkened. Not a shadow, not a trick of failing light, but a discrete patch of atmosphere that absorbed rather than transmitted illumination. It was small, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, hovering at eye level 3 meters away. Mackenzie stared at it, barely breathing, watching the edges pulse and shimmer. Then it was gone. Collapsed into nothing, leaving only rain and mud and the ordinary evening darkness of a Belgian autumn. He stood motionless for several minutes afterward, feeling the same pressure he had experienced camping in this field 5 years earlier. The presence was here, faint but persistent. Whatever doors had opened in 1917 had never fully closed. They remained ajar, and occasionally, for reasons no one understood, they opened wider. The Black Mist was not history. It was an ongoing condition, a permanent alteration in the nature of this place. The war had ended, but its effects continued, subtle and strange, touching anyone perceptive enough to notice. Mackenzie walked back to his car through rain that soaked him to the skin. He was shivering by the time he reached the village, but whether from cold or from proximity to something vast and incomprehensible, he could not say. He drove to Ypres, checked into a small hotel, and spent the night writing detailed notes about what he had witnessed. 3 seconds of visible darkness. Such a small thing, easily dismissed as optical illusion or atmospheric anomaly. But he knew what he had seen, and he knew it mattered. The door was still open. 86 years later, the door was still open. The satellite images arrived at the Pentagon in December 2007, flagged by automated systems monitoring electromagnetic anomalies in active combat zones. Major Lisa Kendrick worked in a division that officially did not exist, buried 3 levels below the main building in offices without windows or designation numbers. Her specialty was pattern recognition, identifying signatures and intelligence data that indicated threats conventional analysis missed. She was 34 years old, career military intelligence, with security clearances that allowed access to information most generals never saw. The images showed a section of Ramadi, Iraq, where U.S. Marine and Army units had been conducting counterinsurgency operations for 18 months. The electromagnetic readings were wrong in ways that suggested equipment malfunction, except that 3 separate satellite passes recorded identical anomalies. Kendrick pulled associated incident reports from the Marine Corps database. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had experienced unusually high rates of psychological casualties during operations in the Malayab district during November. 47 Marines had been evacuated for acute stress reactions over a 2-week period, far exceeding statistical norms. Medical evaluations noted consistent symptoms, temporal disorientation, visual hallucinations featuring non-existent architecture, persistent sensory distortions continuing weeks after the triggering events. The reports used standard diagnostic terminology, but the underlying pattern was familiar to anyone who knew where to look. She had read Andrew Mackenzie's work. Not the published articles, which were academically rigorous but carefully restrained, but the unpublished manuscripts he circulated through informal networks of researchers investigating phenomena military establishments preferred to ignore. Kendrick was part of those networks, one of perhaps 24 intelligence professionals across NATO militaries who understood that modern warfare occasionally produced effects that could not be explained through conventional psychology or weaponry. The Ramadi data matched the Passchendaele pattern exactly. Something was happening in the Malayab district that had happened before in Belgium and Russia and Vietnam. She compiled a briefing package and requested a meeting with her division chief, Colonel Raymond Fowler. He was 58 years old, 2 years from retirement, a career intelligence officer who had served in every major conflict since Grenada. Fowler listened to her presentation without interruption, studied the satellite data, read the casualty reports. When she finished, he sat silent for nearly 2 minutes before responding. His question was simple and devastating. What did she expect him to do with this information? Kendrick proposed sending a specialized team to Ramadi to investigate. Fowler explained why that would not happen. The military existed to wage war, not to investigate metaphysical anomalies. Resources were constrained, personnel were overextended, and operational commanders had neither time nor patience for research projects that could not demonstrate immediate tactical value. More fundamentally, acknowledging that combat produced unexplained psychological effects would undermine confidence in military effectiveness. Soldiers needed to believe their experiences were comprehensible and manageable. Suggesting otherwise would be corrosive to morale and discipline. He did authorize her to conduct remote analysis. She could review reports, interview evacuated personnel if they were accessible, compile data, but no field investigations, no direct contact with operational units, no dissemination of findings outside their division. Her work would be documented and archived under security classifications that ensured it would remain invisible for decades. This was not suppression, Fowler insisted. It was responsible management of sensitive information that could cause more harm than good if mishandled. Kendrick spent 6 months analyzing data from Ramadi and cross-referencing it with historical cases. The consistency was remarkable. Marines described seeing structures identical to those British soldiers had reported 90 years earlier. The brass towers appeared in multiple independent accounts. The Bone Cathedral featured in at least 18 testimonies. One sergeant provided a drawing of the mechanism, sketched from memory 3 weeks after his evacuation. The drawing matched descriptions from Passchendaele and Stalingrad with such precision that coincidence seemed impossible. She identified temporal patterns. The phenomena occurred most frequently during periods of maximum combat intensity, when casualties were highest and fighting was most concentrated geographically. Urban combat produced stronger effects than rural operations. House-to-house fighting, where Marines were clearing buildings methodically while under fire, showed the highest incidence rates. The connection between violence density and anomalous experiences was statistically significant beyond any reasonable doubt. Marine Sergeant David Ortega agreed to an interview at Camp Pendleton, where he was completing rehabilitation before returning to duty. He was 26 years old, on his third deployment, decorated for valor during operations that had left him with injuries both physical and psychological. He described his experience in the Malab district with the careful precision of someone who had told the story to psychiatrists and knew which details made him sound delusional. His squad had been clearing a 3-story building that insurgents were using as a firing position. Standard room clearing procedure, a tactical problem they had solved hundreds of times. But when Ortega entered a second-floor room, the building changed. The walls became transparent, revealing spaces that extended far beyond the structure's actual dimensions. He could see vast chambers filled with machinery that operated with purposeful complexity. The machinery was counting, though he could not explain how he knew this or what was being counted. Time moved incorrectly. He experienced the next 30 seconds as though they required hours to complete. Every moment stretched and subdivided into components he could perceive individually. When normal perception returned, Ortega found himself on the building's roof with no memory of climbing stairs. His squad was searching for him on the ground floor. His radio had transmitted nothing during the incident, despite his conviction that he had been calling for support. Other Marines in the squad reported he had simply vanished while moving through a doorway, then reappeared on the roof 90 seconds later. None could explain the discrepancy between his experience and theirs. Kendrick interviewed 11 other Marines from Ramadi with similar accounts. The details varied, but the underlying structure remained constant. They had entered spaces that should not exist, perceived time operating abnormally, and returned with experiences that did not align with objective documentation. Most had been diagnosed with acute stress reactions and treated with standard psychological interventions. None had been taken seriously when they tried to explain what they had actually experienced. Military psychiatry had categories for trauma responses and dissociative episodes. It had no categories for encounters with impossible architecture or machinery existing outside normal space-time. She expanded her investigation to other contemporary conflicts. Afghanistan produced similar patterns. British forces operating in Helmand province during 2006 reported psychological casualties consistent with the Passchendaele syndrome. Urban fighting in Musa Qala and Sangin had produced clusters of cases where soldiers experienced mass hallucinations featuring identical architectural elements. The Ministry of Defense had documented the incidents, attributed them to combat stress, and archived the reports under restrictions that prevented wider analysis. Israeli defense forces had encountered the phenomena during urban operations in Lebanon and Gaza. Medical officers noted unusual psychological presentations among soldiers who had been engaged in intense, sustained combat within confined urban terrain. The descriptions matched the historical pattern. Russian forces in Chechnya, specifically during the battles for Grozny in the mid-90s and again in 1999, had reported similar casualties. The incidents were recorded but never analyzed as part of a broader pattern because different militaries did not share information about psychological vulnerabilities. Kendrick realized she was documenting a phenomenon that affected all combatants regardless of nationality, ideology, or technological sophistication. Whatever conditions produced the black mist operated universally. Wars created them wherever fighting concentrated sufficient violence within restricted geographical spaces. The effect was predictable, reproducible, and completely ignored by military establishments that preferred not to acknowledge experiences outside conventional frameworks. She began developing predictive models. If the phenomenon correlated with violence density and geographical confinement, it should be possible to identify conditions likely to produce anomalous experiences before they occurred. Urban warfare presented the highest risk, particularly operations requiring repeated assaults on fortified positions. Prolonged sieges showed elevated incident rates. Any situation forcing large numbers of personnel to engage in sustained lethal combat within areas measuring less than a few square kilometers created optimal conditions. The models worked. Using historical data, Kendrick could predict with 78% accuracy which battles would produce significant numbers of psychological casualties matching the Passchendaele pattern. The predictive value was statistically robust, suggesting she had identified genuine causal relationships rather than spurious correlations. But operational utility was questionable. Knowing that certain tactical situations would produce unexplained psychological effects did nothing to prevent those situations if military necessity required them. In March 2009, she briefed her findings to a working group comprising intelligence officers from several NATO nations. The meeting was classified, held at a facility in Northern Virginia, attended by perhaps 20 personnel with appropriate clearances. Kendrick presented her data, explained her methodology, demonstrated the predictive models. The response was professional skepticism mixed with uncomfortable recognition. Several attendees had encountered similar patterns in their own data but had lacked the broader context to understand what they were observing. A Canadian major asked the obvious question, what were they supposed to do with this information? Kendrick had no satisfactory answer. The phenomenon could be predicted but not prevented. Understanding that certain combat conditions produced encounters with impossible architecture did nothing to change military necessity. If operational objectives required urban warfare or prolonged sieges, those operations would proceed regardless of psychological risks. Knowledge without applicable remedies was simply documentation of problems that could not be solved. The British representative, a colonel named Martin Fletcher, contributed a historical perspective. His ministry had been monitoring these incidents since at least 1917. 92 years of documentation had produced no interventions, no protective measures, no methods for preventing or mitigating the experiences. Affected personnel received standard psychological treatment, which was sometimes effective at managing symptoms but never addressed underlying causes. The phenomena continued occurring. Militaries continued documenting them, and nothing changed because institutional priorities lay elsewhere. Fletcher mentioned that certain ministry files suggested the effects might be intensifying. Incident rates in recent conflicts appeared higher than historical baselines, though differences in diagnostic criteria and reporting standards made direct comparisons difficult. If the trend was real rather than artifactual, it implied that either modern warfare created more intense reality distortions than historical conflicts, or that accumulated damage from centuries of warfare had left reality permanently altered in ways that made new distortions more likely. The working group produced a report that was immediately classified at levels, ensuring it would never inform operational planning. The document acknowledged that modern combat occasionally produced unexplained psychological phenomena, noted that these phenomena correlated with specific tactical conditions, and recommended continued monitoring. No policy changes were suggested. No new treatment protocols were proposed. The report joined thousands of similar documents in secure archives where it would remain until automatic declassification schedules released it decades hence, long after everyone involved was dead or retired. Kendrick continued her work, aware that it would produce no meaningful impact on military practice. She documented incidents from Iraq and Afghanistan, tracked patterns across multiple theaters, refined her predictive models. The research was intellectually satisfying and operationally irrelevant. She was compiling the most comprehensive analysis of battlefield reality distortions ever assembled by a government institution. And it would change nothing because changing anything would require acknowledging things military establishments could not afford to acknowledge. In June 2011, she received an email from Professor Andrew Mackenzie. He had somehow obtained her contact information despite security protocols designed to prevent such connections. The email was brief and carefully worded to avoid triggering automated monitoring systems. He understood she was conducting research in areas relevant to his own work. Perhaps they could share information in ways that would be mutually beneficial while respecting her professional obligations. Kendrick knew she should not respond. Communicating with civilian researchers about classified matters violated numerous regulations. But Mackenzie represented institutional memory and analytical frameworks her military colleagues lacked. He had been investigating these phenomena for over a decade, had access to historical sources and international networks she could not reach through official channels. The potential value outweighed the career risks. They began corresponding through carefully anonymized channels, never discussing specific classified information but sharing analytical approaches and theoretical frameworks. Mackenzie's hypothesis about consciousness distorting space-time provided a conceptual foundation for understanding patterns in Kendrick's data. Her statistical models validated aspects of his theory that had been purely speculative. Together, they developed a more sophisticated understanding of what the black mist represented and why it continued manifesting across different conflicts and eras. The fundamental insight was simple and disturbing. Human consciousness was not merely an observer of physical reality, but an active participant in constructing it. Under normal conditions, individual consciousness exerted negligible influence on large-scale space-time structure, but when thousands of minds simultaneously experienced extreme states, particularly states involving imminent death and intense violence, their collective effect became measurable. They created localized distortions in the fabric of reality, tears through which other spaces became temporarily accessible. Wars were the larger-scale consciousness experiments humans conducted, though they never recognized them as such. Battles concentrated thousands or millions of minds in extreme states within confined geographical regions. The intensity and density of consciousness experiencing mortal terror was unprecedented in any other human activity. Under those conditions, reality became malleable in ways that violated standard physics but followed rules that consciousness-based models could potentially describe. The implications were profound. If consciousness could distort space-time structure, then psychological warfare took on entirely new meaning. If battles created tears in reality, then strategic planning needed to consider not just conventional effects, but also the metaphysical consequences of concentrating violence. If the black mist represented genuine encounters with alternative dimensional spaces, then affected personnel were not suffering from psychological disorders, but from accurate perceptions of phenomena that should not exist according to consensus reality. None of these implications could be discussed openly. The theoretical framework remained confined to private correspondence between a military intelligence officer and an academic researcher, neither of whom could publish their findings without destroying their careers. They were documenting a revolution in understanding the nature of warfare and consciousness, and that revolution would remain classified indefinitely because the institutions they served could not accommodate truths that undermined fundamental assumptions about how reality operated. Kendrick deployed to Afghanistan in 2012, assigned to a forward intelligence element supporting operations in Kandahar province. The deployment was routine, standard rotation for officers in her specialty, but it placed her in proximity to ongoing combat operations where she could observe the phenomena she had been studying through direct experience rather than remote analysis. She did not seek out danger, but she positioned herself where danger was unavoidable. In August, her compound came under sustained attack. Taliban forces launched a coordinated assault using rockets, mortars, and small arms fire. The attack lasted 6 hours, involved perhaps 50 insurgents, and was eventually repelled with close air support and reinforcements from nearby bases. Kendrick spent most of the engagement in a bunker, performing her assigned duties coordinating intelligence support for the defense. Nothing about her experience was unusual compared to what thousands of other personnel had endured in similar situations, except for 90 seconds during the 3rd hour of the attack, when the bunker's interior darkened and she found herself somewhere else. The darkness was absolute and textured, like being submerged in thick liquid that absorbed all light. She could hear machinery operating nearby, the same purposeful clicking and humming that witnesses had described across a century of conflicts. Time stretched and folded, each second subdividing into components she could perceive individually while simultaneously experiencing their totality. She saw structures, vast and geometric, composed of materials that were simultaneously solid and permeable. The brass towers rose in the distance, their surfaces reflecting light from sources she could not identify. Then she was back in the bunker, gasping, her hands gripping the edge of the desk hard enough that her fingers ached. The attack continued. Radio chatter filled her headset. Other personnel in the bunker showed no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Kendrick checked her watch. 90 seconds had elapsed according to the chronometer, though the experience had felt like hours. She was shaking, not from fear but from proximity to something vast and incomprehensible that had briefly allowed her to perceive its existence. She understood then what the men at Passchendaele had experienced, what Marines in Ramadi and soldiers in Stalingrad and warriors across centuries of warfare had touched and tried to explain to people who could not understand. The black mist was not hallucination or delusion or stress response. It was a door opening into spaces that existed alongside normal reality, spaces that wars made temporarily accessible. She had walked through that door, seen what lay beyond, and returned with knowledge that would change how she understood everything. The deployment ended in December. Kendrick returned to the Pentagon and resumed her analytical work. But she was no longer studying the phenomenon from outside. She had become one of the affected, one of the thousands who carried memories of impossible experiences and knowledge that could not be shared. The work continued, documentation accumulated, and the black mist persisted across battlefields, where humans concentrated violence and death in quantities sufficient to tear holes in the fabric of reality. The door remained open. It had always been open. Wars simply made it visible. The network began forming in 2014, connecting people who had walked through darkness and returned, changed. It started with online forums where veterans discussed experiences they could not share with families or therapists. The conversations were carefully coded, using terminology that sounded like standard combat trauma discussion to anyone monitoring casually, but carried specific meanings to those who understood. References to seeing impossible architecture or experiencing time differently signaled membership in an exclusive community bound by shared encounter with phenomena that officially did not exist. Within 2 years, the network included approximately 300 individuals from 14 countries, representing conflicts spanning 7 decades. Michael Chen discovered the forums while researching his grandfather's military service. Chen was 29 years old, a software engineer in San Francisco, third-generation American whose grandfather had served with the Marines at Hughes City in 1968. The old man had died in 2009, but before his death, he had given Chen a box containing letters, photographs, and a journal written during his Vietnam deployment. The journal described experiences in Hue that matched accounts Chen had encountered while reading about historical military anomalies. His grandfather had walked through the black mist, though he had never used that term, and had spent 40 years carrying memories he could share with no one. Chen built a database aggregating accounts from across the network. He was not a researcher or historian, simply someone with technical skills and personal investment in understanding what his grandfather had experienced. The database grew to include over 800 documented cases, spanning from the Great War through contemporary conflicts in Syria and Yemen. Each entry contained witness testimony, location data, dates, descriptions of observed phenomena, and information about long-term effects experienced by affected individuals. The consistency across time and geography was statistically impossible if these were independent hallucinations generated by stressed minds. Patterns emerged that suggested the phenomena were not random. Certain geographical locations showed repeated incidents across different conflicts. Passchendaele had produced anomalous experiences in 1917 and continued showing residual effects decades later. Stalingrad manifested the Black Mist during World War II and again during the Chechen Wars, when fighting returned to the city renamed Volgograd. Specific buildings in Huay City that had been sites of intense combat in 1968 were again associated with unexplained experiences when U.S. forces returned to Vietnam for training exercises in the 2000s. The implication disturbed Chen more than the phenomena themselves. If locations retained some property that made reality distortions more likely, then the effects were not temporary psychological reactions, but permanent alterations in the physical structure of those places. Wars were not merely destroying lives and infrastructure. They were damaging reality itself in ways that persisted long after fighting ended. The Earth remembered violence, and that memory manifested as tears in the fabric of normal space-time. He contacted Major Lisa Kendrick through channels established by the network. Their initial conversation was cautious, both aware of security implications and potential consequences of discussing classified matters. But Kendrick recognized in Chen's database something she had been trying to build within military intelligence systems, but could never complete due to classification restrictions and institutional resistance. His civilian network had accomplished what official channels could not, because it operated outside bureaucratic constraints and security protocols that prevented information sharing. Kendrick provided analytical frameworks and statistical methodologies that allowed Chen to extract deeper patterns from the data. He contributed programming expertise and database architecture that made large-scale analysis possible. Together, they developed predictive models significantly more sophisticated than anything military intelligence had produced. The models incorporated geographical factors, combat intensity metrics, casualty densities, and temporal patterns. Given sufficient information about ongoing military operations, they could predict with 86% accuracy where and when reality distortions would occur. Professor Andrew Mackenzie joined their collaboration in 2015. He was approaching 70 years old, officially retired, but continuing research with the obsessive focus of someone who had devoted decades to questions that consumed him. The three of them represented different institutional perspectives: military intelligence, civilian academia, independent research networks. Their combined expertise produced insights none could have achieved individually. They documented what they termed threshold effects. Reality distortions did not occur during every battle, but only when violence intensity exceeded specific levels. The threshold varied based on geographical and temporal factors, but approximate parameters could be established. Combat involving fewer than 500 active combatants rarely produced observable effects, regardless of intensity. Engagements lasting less than 6 hours showed low incidence rates even with high casualty counts. But operations concentrating more than 1,000 combatants in areas smaller than 2 square kilometers for periods exceeding 12 hours consistently produced reality distortions once casualty rates reached approximately 15%. The mathematics suggested something profound about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Human minds under extreme stress exerted measurable effects on space-time structure, but only when present in sufficient density and intensity. Individual consciousness was too weak to significantly distort reality. Collective consciousness during normal circumstances was similarly ineffective because minds were not synchronized in their emotional and perceptual states. But warfare created conditions where thousands of minds simultaneously experienced identical extreme states: terror and rage, and desperate focus on survival, all concentrated in tiny geographical regions. Under those conditions, consciousness became a force capable of tearing holes in reality. Kendrick used her intelligence access to test the models against current operations. Syrian civil war data provided abundant validation opportunities. Urban warfare in Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus created conditions that should produce reality distortions according to their predictive framework. She obtained after-action reports and medical evacuation records through channels that would have been unauthorized if anyone was monitoring closely. The data confirmed model predictions. Syrian government forces, rebel factions, and foreign military personnel all reported psychological casualties consistent with the Passchendaele syndrome during battles exceeding the identified thresholds. A Russian pilot flying ground attack missions over Aleppo in 2016 experienced temporal distortions during a low-altitude pass. For subjective duration of nearly 5 minutes, though his aircraft's flight recorder showed only 40 seconds elapsed, he flew through airspace that contained structures impossible according to conventional physics. The brass towers rose from the ruined city like spears thrust upward into a sky that was not sky but some kind of membrane. He saw through the membrane into other places, other battles, other times. Images overlapped. Aleppo burning in 2016, Stalingrad burning in 1942, cities he did not recognize burning in eras he could not identify. When normal perception returned, the pilot found his aircraft had flown 3 kilometers further than his conscious memory of navigation would suggest. His weapons had been released, though he had no memory of pressing the firing controls. The mission recorder showed he had transmitted no radio communications during the 40-second period, despite his conviction that he had been calling for guidance. Medical evaluation diagnosed acute stress reaction, prescribed standard treatment, and returned him to flight status after 2 weeks. The report was filed and forgotten, one more psychological casualty in a war producing them by the thousands. Chen's database recorded the incident along with hundreds of similar accounts from Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and other active conflict zones. The patterns were global and contemporary. The black mist was not historical anomaly, but ongoing phenomenon affecting modern warfare exactly as it had affected conflicts throughout the 20th century. Every major battle produced cases. Every urban siege generated clusters of affected personnel. The statistics were overwhelming. Either mass hallucinations were occurring at unprecedented scales across all combatant forces, regardless of nationality or culture, or wars were genuinely creating conditions that allowed human consciousness to perceive realities normally inaccessible. In October 2017, the network organized a conference. It was held at a rural property in Vermont, hosted by a veteran who had experienced the phenomena during operations in Fallujah and now ran a retreat center for former military personnel. 73 individuals attended, representing 12 nationalities and conflicts spanning from Vietnam to Syria. Security was maintained through obscurity rather than official protocols. The gathering was advertised as a veterans' support retreat. No agendas were published. No proceedings were recorded. The attendees spent 3 days sharing experiences and comparing observations. Many were meeting in person for the first time, people they had communicated with online for years. The conversations were remarkable for their specificity and consistency. Men and women who had fought in different wars on different continents described identical architectural elements seen during reality distortions. The brass towers appeared in accounts from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. The Bone Cathedral featured in testimonies from veterans of conflicts in Lebanon, Chechnya, and Somalia. The mechanism that counted in the darkness was reported by soldiers from a dozen militaries across 5 decades. Some attendees exhibited persistent effects that supported the hypothesis that exposure to the phenomena created lasting changes in human consciousness. A British sergeant who had experienced the Black Mist during operations in Helmand Province could predict equipment failures with uncanny accuracy, sensing mechanical problems hours before they manifested. An Iraqi interpreter who had been present during intense fighting in Mosul described perceiving emotional states in others with such clarity it bordered on telepathy. A French soldier who had served in Mali experienced periodic temporal dislocations where he perceived events seconds before they occurred, though never with enough warning to act on the information. These effects were subtle and unreliable, more curse than gift. The British sergeant could not explain how he knew aircraft engines were about to fail. The Iraqi interpreter found crowds overwhelming, their emotional states flooding his perception with information he could not filter. The French soldier experienced constant anxiety from glimpses of futures he could neither prevent nor properly interpret. They were not superpowers, but disabilities. Evidence that walking through torn reality left permanent marks on consciousness that manifested as distorted relationships with time and causality. Dr. Sarah Whitman attended the conference. She was 41 years old, a neuroscientist specializing in consciousness studies, affiliated with a research institute in Massachusetts. She had no military background but had been investigating reports of anomalous perceptual experiences for over a decade. Her research had led her to the network, where she recognized patterns relevant to her theoretical work on the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The Vermont conference gave her access to dozens of subjects exhibiting effects that mainstream neuroscience insisted were impossible. She conducted informal assessments, testing cognitive functions and perceptual capabilities. The results suggested that exposure to reality distortions produced measurable neurological changes. Brain imaging conducted on volunteers after the conference showed unusual activity patterns in regions associated with temporal processing and spatial perception. The changes were subtle, but consistent across subjects, suggesting some form of lasting neurological reorganization following encounters with the black mist. Whitman proposed a hypothesis. Human brains evolved to process information from 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, the normal structure of space-time as humans experienced it. But if reality distortions exposed consciousness to additional dimensions or alternative space-time configurations, the brain might adapt by developing new processing capabilities. The enhanced perceptual abilities some veterans exhibited were not supernatural gifts, but evolutionary responses, brains reorganizing to handle information from dimensional structures they were never designed to process. The hypothesis was testable, but testing would require resources and institutional support that Whitman could not obtain. No funding agency would finance research premised on the existence of dimensional spaces accessible during warfare. No ethics committee would approve experiments investigating neurological effects of combat exposure to phenomena that officially did not exist. Her work remained theoretical, supported by informal assessments and anecdotal evidence that would never satisfy scientific peer review standards. The conference concluded with recognition that the network served important functions but could accomplish little beyond mutual support and documentation. They were witnesses to phenomena that militaries and governments had suppressed for a century. Their testimonies were consistent and detailed, supported by decades of accumulated evidence. But they lacked power to force official acknowledgement or change institutional responses. Military establishments would continue treating affected personnel as psychological casualties. Intelligence agencies would continue classifying information about reality distortions. The network would continue operating in margins, documenting truths that broader society refused to accept. Michael Chen returned to San Francisco determined to expand the database and improve analytical capabilities. He had documentation of over 1,000 incidents spanning from 1917 to 2017. The data represented the most comprehensive record of battlefield reality distortions ever assembled outside classified military archives. It demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that wars produced effects extending far beyond conventional understanding of combat trauma and psychological stress. He began developing visualization tools that would make the patterns more accessible to researchers and potentially to broader audiences. Maps showing locations where incidents had occurred revealed geographical clusters that suggested certain regions of Earth were more susceptible to reality distortions. Temporal analyses showed incident rates increasing over the past century, though whether this reflected actual intensification of effects or improved documentation remained unclear. Statistical models predicted that ongoing conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan would continue producing cases at rates exceeding historical averages. The work was consuming and professionally risky. Chen was employed by a major technology company whose security policies prohibited involvement in projects that might compromise corporate reputation. If his employers discovered he was operating a database documenting military psychological anomalies and communicating with active-duty intelligence personnel about classified matters, termination would be immediate and accompanied by potential legal action. He maintained operational security carefully, using encrypted communications and anonymous hosting services, but awareness of the risks was constant. In March 2018, he received a message through network channels. The sender identified himself as a serving officer in the U.S. Army stationed at a base in eastern Afghanistan. His unit had experienced multiple incidents consistent with the Passchendaele syndrome during operations against Taliban forces in Nangarhar province. Medical evacuation rates for psychological casualties had exceeded 20% during their recent deployment, far above normal ranges. The officer had found references to the network, understood they were documenting similar cases, and wanted to contribute his observations to the database. Chen added the data, noting that Nangarhar province was showing patterns similar to Ramadi, Aleppo, and other locations where sustained urban combat had created optimal conditions for reality distortions. The province was becoming what he termed a hot zone, a geographical region where the fabric of reality had been damaged by accumulated violence to the point that new distortions occurred more easily and frequently. The implications were disturbing. If hot zones persisted and expanded, future conflicts would encounter the phenomena at increasing rates until battlefield reality distortions became too common to suppress or explain away through conventional psychiatric frameworks. Lisa Kendrick reached the same conclusion through independent analysis of classified intelligence data. Hot zones were forming in multiple locations globally. Passchendaele remained anomalous a century after the battle. Stalingrad showed persistent effects 80 years after the siege. Newer zones were emerging in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, where sustained modern warfare was tearing new holes in reality. The damage appeared to be cumulative and permanent. Wars were not merely destroying cities and populations. They were fundamentally altering the nature of physical reality in ways that would persist for centuries. She compiled a report documenting the phenomenon and recommending immediate policy reviews. The report argued that military planning needed to account for metaphysical consequences of sustained combat operations. If battles damaged space-time structure in lasting ways, then strategic calculations should include long-term costs extending beyond conventional metrics of casualties and infrastructure destruction. Urban warfare should be avoided when possible because concentrated fighting in populated areas created optimal conditions for reality distortions. When urban operations were unavoidable, intensity and duration should be limited to minimize damage to the fabric of reality itself. The report was reviewed by her division chief and immediately classified at levels, ensuring it would never inform operational planning. Colonel Fowler, now in his final year before retirement, explained the institutional reality with weary clarity. The military existed to accomplish strategic objectives through controlled application of violence, suggesting that violence produced metaphysical consequences that should constrain operational planning was politically and bureaucratically impossible. No general would accept limitations on tactical options based on theoretical claims about damaging space-time. No political leadership would approve strategies premised on the existence of dimensional anomalies. Kendrick understood she had reached the limits of what could be accomplished through official channels. The network, operating in margins and shadows, had more freedom to document and analyze the phenomena than classified military intelligence programs. She began transferring information to Chen's database, carefully anonymizing classified details but preserving analytical value. It was technically treason, violating security protocols and potentially compromising national security. But she had walked through the black mist. She knew what waited in those torn spaces, and she understood that institutions refusing to acknowledge the truth were failing in their fundamental responsibility to protect personnel under their command. The network continued growing. By 2019, membership exceeded 500 individuals. They were documenting reality distortions occurring in real time across active combat zones. They were tracking persistent effects in veterans decades after their exposures. They were assembling evidence that wars changed fundamental properties of physical reality in ways that science could not yet explain but could no longer ignore. The work continued in obscurity, supported by people whose experiences had taught them that official reality was incomplete and that truth often survived only in margins where institutions refused to look. The black mist persisted. It had always persisted. And with every new war, every prolonged battle, every concentration of violence and death in confined spaces, new doors opened into darkness that waited patiently for humans to tear reality sufficiently that it could enter. The envelope arrived at Michael Chen's apartment in February 2023, delivered by a courier service that had no record of who had hired them. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note on paper that bore no watermark or identifying characteristics. The note consisted of a single sentence: "They are preparing to open one deliberately." Chen held the drive for nearly 10 minutes before deciding to examine its contents. He was 38 years old now, had been operating the network for 9 years, and had learned to recognize when something fundamental was about to change. The drive contained classified documents marked with security designations he had never seen, technical specifications for equipment he did not recognize, and a project designation, Threshold Initiative. The documents described a military research program begun in 2019 under authority so restricted that fewer than 50 individuals across the entire Department of Defense knew of its existence. The program's objective was stated with bureaucratic precision that made the impossibility sound routine: develop methodologies for deliberately inducing controlled reality distortions to create strategic advantages in combat operations. If wars accidentally tore holes in space-time that allowed access to other dimensional structures, perhaps those tears could be created intentionally, weaponized, and deployed against adversaries. Chen read through technical specifications that describe machinery designed to concentrate electromagnetic fields in configurations matching patterns observed at sites where natural reality distortions occurred. The theory was that if consciousness under extreme stress could tear reality, perhaps sufficiently intense electromagnetic pulses targeting specific space-time geometries could produce similar effects without requiring actual combat. The machinery was massive, requiring power supplies comparable to those used in particle physics experiments, but theoretically transportable and deployable in forward operational areas. Initial testing had occurred at a military facility in Nevada during late 2021. The tests were unsuccessful in producing observable reality distortions, but had generated sufficient anomalous readings to justify continued funding. Refinements to the electromagnetic pulse configurations were implemented. A second round of testing was scheduled for June 2023 at a location redacted from the documents Chen possessed. The objective was to create a stable, controllable tear in space-time that could be opened for periods exceeding 5 minutes and closed without lasting effects on the surrounding area. He contacted Lisa Kendrick immediately. She was now a lieutenant colonel, still assigned to the Pentagon division that officially did not exist, still analyzing patterns in data that military leadership refused to acknowledge. The Threshold Initiative was news to her, classified at levels above her access, despite her decade of research into the phenomena it sought to replicate. She began investigating through intelligence channels, carefully, aware that asking too many questions about deeply classified programs could end her career and potentially result in prosecution. What she discovered over the following 2 weeks terrified her with an intensity she had not experienced since walking through the black mist in Afghanistan 11 years earlier. The Threshold Initiative was not merely a research program. It was a weapons development project with operational timelines and deployment plans. The military establishment that had spent a century suppressing evidence of reality distortions was now attempting to create them on demand. Scientists and engineers who had never experienced the phenomena, who understood them only through sanitized technical reports, were building machinery to tear holes in the fabric of reality because they believed such capabilities would provide strategic advantages. Professor Andrew Mackenzie was 82 years old, his health failing, his memory beginning to show gaps that frustrated him more than he admitted. But when Chen contacted him about the Threshold Initiative, his response was immediate and clear. This was the nightmare scenario he had privately feared since he first began researching the Black Mist. Deliberately inducing reality distortions without understanding their nature or consequences was insanity elevated to weapons policy. The military was proposing to weaponize forces that had traumatized thousands of soldiers across a century of accidental exposures. He wrote a letter to officials at the Ministry of Defense, carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information while making clear that certain research directions posed existential risks. The letter was acknowledged with bureaucratic courtesy and ignored substantively. Mackenzie held no official position, possessed no current security clearances, and was advocating for restrictions on programs he should not know existed. His decades of research into battlefield anomalies had made him a marginal figure whose warnings carried no institutional weight. Dr. Sarah Whitman approached the problem from a different angle. Her neuroscience research had documented lasting damage to personnel who experienced reality distortions accidentally. Deliberately exposing soldiers to such phenomena would be medical experimentation on human subjects without informed consent or adequate safety protocols. She compiled evidence from her decade of research into a formal complaint filed with the Department of Defense Inspector General, arguing that the Threshold Initiative violated federal regulations protecting human research subjects. The complaint was received, investigated by personnel without appropriate security clearances to access information about the program they were investigating, and dismissed as referring to activities that could not be confirmed to exist. Whitman received a polite letter thanking her for her concern and assuring her that all Department of Defense research programs complied with applicable regulations. The letter was signed by an official whose name appeared on no organizational charts and whose office telephone number connected to a recording stating the extension was no longer in service. The network mobilized with urgency, born of recognition that this was the crisis toward which a century of suppressed history had been building. 500 members across 14 countries began investigating, using military contacts, intelligence connections, and technical expertise to piece together information about a program designed to remain invisible. What emerged was fragmentary, but sufficient to understand the scope and timeline. Testing was scheduled for June 15, 2023, at a location that multiple sources identified as a decommissioned military facility in the Arizona desert. The machinery had been assembled over 18 months. Its components manufactured by defense contractors who understood they were building electromagnetic pulse generators, but not their intended application. Technical personnel who would operate the equipment had been trained on systems they were told represented advanced electronic warfare capabilities. None had been informed they would be attempting to tear holes in space-time. Security around the facility was extensive and sophisticated. Military police from units specializing in protecting nuclear weapons facilities provided perimeter security. Access was restricted to personnel with specialized clearances verified through biometric systems. Electronic countermeasures prevented unauthorized surveillance. The program was protected with resources suggesting leadership believed it was strategically vital and potentially decisive. Chen spent 3 months analyzing the implications. If the Threshold Initiative succeeded in creating controlled reality distortions, the immediate consequences would likely be catastrophic. Exposing personnel to the phenomena deliberately would produce psychological casualties at rates far exceeding those from accidental exposures. The machinery might create tears larger or more persistent than those generated by combat conditions, potentially allowing entities or forces from other dimensional spaces to enter normal reality. Even if the program successfully created brief, controllable distortions, weaponizing the technology would lead inevitably to its use in combat, multiplying the number of hot zones where reality remained permanently damaged. But the long-term consequences disturbed him more than immediate risks. If one military developed reality distortion weapons, others would follow. Within a decade, every major power would possess capabilities for tearing holes in space-time. The cumulative effect of weaponized reality distortions deployed across multiple conflicts could damage the fundamental structure of physical reality beyond any possibility of recovery. Humanity would be conducting warfare that destroyed not merely lives and infrastructure, but the basic stability of the dimensional framework within which existence occurred. Kendrick used her intelligence access to identify key decision-makers in the program's chain of command. The Threshold Initiative reported to a 3-star general whose career had been built on managing advanced weapons programs. He was 60 years old, respected within the defense establishment, scheduled for promotion to 4th star pending successful demonstration of capabilities under his oversight. The scheduled test in June was intended to validate the program's technical approach and justify expanded funding for operational development. She requested a meeting, claiming she possessed analytical information relevant to the program's objectives. The request was approved after 2 weeks of vetting. She was granted 15 minutes with the general's deputy, a colonel who listened with professional courtesy while she explained that decades of evidence showed reality distortions produced lasting psychological damage to exposed personnel and permanent alterations to affected geographical regions. The colonel thanked her for her input, noted that all safety considerations were being addressed through appropriate channels, and terminated the meeting after 12 minutes. Kendrick understood she had failed. The institutional momentum behind the Threshold Initiative was too strong to be stopped by warnings from a mid-level intelligence officer whose research had never been officially acknowledged. The program would proceed to testing because careers and budgets and strategic assumptions depended on it proceeding. No amount of evidence about risks would overcome the organizational and political investments already made. The network concluded that official channels had been exhausted. On May 20th, 2023, Chen released the classified documents to investigative journalists at 3 major news organizations. The release was carefully orchestrated to maximize impact while minimizing Chen's legal exposure. The documents were authenticated by multiple sources, contextualized with unclassified research about historical reality distortions, and presented as evidence of a weapons program posing existential risks to global stability. The response was immediate and polarized. News coverage focused on the sensational aspects: secret military programs, weaponized dimensional portals, suppressed evidence of battlefield anomalies spanning a century. Congressional representatives demanded briefings. Defense Department spokespersons issued carefully worded denials that did not actually deny the program's existence but refused to confirm classified activities. Public debate divided between those who accepted the evidence and those who dismissed the entire story as conspiracy theory or elaborate hoax. Within the defense establishment, reaction was fury and determination. The leak had compromised a deeply classified program and potentially violated laws protecting national security information. Investigation into the source began immediately, utilizing resources and expertise typically reserved for espionage cases. Chen's identity was discovered within 72 hours, despite his precautions. Federal agents appeared at his apartment at 0600 on May the 24th. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of unlawful disclosure of classified information and theft of government property. Lisa Kendrick was placed under investigation the same day. Her communications with Chen had been discovered through surveillance of his network activity. She was relieved of her duties, her security clearances suspended pending completion of administrative and potentially criminal proceedings. The military career she had built over 2 decades ended in a conference room where investigators informed her she was suspected of providing classified information to unauthorized personnel and participating in a conspiracy to damage national security. Andrew Mackenzie learned of the arrests through news coverage. He was too old and too far from active involvement to face prosecution, but the network he had helped build was being systematically dismantled by authorities determined to suppress information and punish those who had released it. He spent his final weeks writing a comprehensive account of his decades researching the Black Mist, documenting everything he had learned about reality distortions and the institutional forces that suppressed knowledge of them. The manuscript was completed on June 8th. He died on June the 10th, his heart simply stopping while he sat in the garden behind his Edinburgh home, surrounded by flowers he had planted but would not see bloom. The Threshold Initiative test proceeded as scheduled on June 15th, despite public controversy and congressional pressure for delays pending oversight hearings. Military leadership made the calculation that demonstrating successful capabilities would justify the program and silence critics. If the machinery could create controlled reality distortions without adverse effects, Concerns about risks would be rendered moot by functional proof of concept. The test began at 0900 hours Mountain Daylight Time. Electromagnetic pulse generators activated in carefully sequenced patterns designed to reproduce the space-time geometries observed at locations where natural reality distortions had occurred. Power levels were increased gradually over a 30-minute period, while monitoring equipment recorded readings from dozens of sensors positioned throughout the facility. At 0932, anomalous readings began appearing. Localized distortions in electromagnetic fields, gravity measurements showing impossible variations, temporal sensors recording desynchronization between atomic clocks that should have been perfectly matched. At 0937, something opened. Personnel in the observation bunker reported darkness manifesting in the test chamber, a zone of absolute black approximately 3 meters in diameter, hovering 2 meters above the concrete floor. The darkness was not absence of light, but presence of something that absorbed illumination so completely that photons ceased to exist upon contact. Monitoring equipment near the darkness began malfunctioning, video feeds corrupted, displaying geometries that should not be possible in two-dimensional representations. Audio pickups recorded sounds that analysis would later determine were not vibrations in air, but something else. Patterns of information encoded in formats human nervous systems could partially perceive as sound. The darkness expanded. Within 90 seconds, it measured 6 meters across and was growing at increasing rates. The test director ordered immediate shutdown of the electromagnetic pulse generators. The shutdown sequence initiated, but the darkness continued expanding, apparently no longer dependent on the machinery that had created it. At 0941, the darkness touched the chamber's wall. The concrete did not crack or crumble. It ceased to exist in the three-dimensional space humans occupied, replaced by surface of something that witnesses struggled to describe. Walls made of material that was simultaneously solid and permeable, marked with patterns that hurt to perceive, extending into dimensional configurations that violated basic assumptions about how physical structures could exist. Evacuation protocols activated at 0942. 117 personnel were in the facility. 73 evacuated successfully before the darkness expanded beyond the test chamber. 44 were caught in the expanding zone where normal reality had ceased operating according to familiar rules. Their fates were documented through video feeds that continued transmitting until the darkness consumed the cameras and transformed photons into something else. They experienced what soldiers at Passchendaele had experienced, what Marines at Hugh City and Ramadi had touched accidentally, what veterans across a century had tried to explain to people who could not understand. The brass towers rose around them, kilometers tall, their surfaces reflecting light from sources that existed in other dimensional configurations. The bone cathedral materialized, its walls organic and terrible, its ceiling opening into darkness that felt infinite and hungry. The mechanism emerged, vast beyond comprehension, counting events that measured transformations between possible and actual across realities humans had never named. Time operated incorrectly. Subjective experience of duration bore no relationship to clock time. Seconds stretched into hours. Minutes collapsed into moments. Personnel experienced their own deaths repeatedly, perceiving each possible termination of their existence simultaneously while remaining somehow alive to experience the next. They saw through barriers that normally separated past, present, and future, witnessing all moments of their existence as single unified structure that could be perceived in totality but not altered or escaped. The darkness stopped expanding at 0956. It had consumed approximately 30% of the facility, creating a zone measuring roughly 200 meters across where normal physical laws no longer applied consistently. Military forces surrounded the area, establishing perimeter security while decision-makers thousands of miles away in Washington attempted to understand what had occurred and formulate appropriate responses. The 44 personnel trapped in the zone were considered casualties. Whether they were dead in any conventional sense remained unclear. Video feeds and electromagnetic sensors showed movement within the darkness, human-shaped figures or something that had been human moving through spaces that intersected with normal reality at angles that should not exist. Audio pickups recorded sounds that might have been voices calling for help or might have been something else using patterns that resembled human speech without actually being language. At 1600 hours, 6 hours and 53 minutes after the test began, the darkness collapsed. It happened instantaneously, the zone of altered reality contracting from 200 meters to zero in less than 1 second. The facility reappeared, its structure intact but fundamentally changed. Walls that had been concrete were now composed of materials that resembled concrete but possessed properties that violated materials science. Floors were solid and stable, but electromagnetic surveys showed them existing simultaneously in multiple spatial configurations. The air smelled of ozone and something organic that chemical analysis could not identify. Of the 44 personnel caught in the darkness, 17 were recovered. They were alive by medical definitions, hearts beating and lungs breathing, but profoundly changed. Neural imaging showed brain activity patterns that should not be possible in living humans. They did not speak, did not respond to external stimuli, did not exhibit signs of consciousness as conventionally understood. Their eyes remained open, tracking movements with precision, suggesting awareness, but they appeared to be perceiving things not present in normal reality. Medical teams evacuated them to facilities equipped to handle extreme psychological trauma, aware they were treating conditions without precedent or established protocols. 27 personnel were never recovered. They had either died within the darkness or been transported to locations that did not intersect with normal space-time in ways that allowed retrieval. Search operations continued for 3 days before being suspended. The facility was sealed, designated as contaminated with hazards classified above nuclear or biological threats, and placed under security protocols that would maintain quarantine indefinitely. The Threshold Initiative was terminated. Congressional investigations began immediately, seeking to establish who had authorized the program and why safety concerns had been ignored. Defense Department officials testified under oath while classifying most substantive information, leaving public record fragmented and incomplete. Criminal prosecutions were initiated against several senior officers, though cases were complicated by arguments that actions had been taken under legitimate authority for national security purposes. Michael Chen remained in federal custody, awaiting trial. The charges against him included disclosure of classified information, theft of government property, and conspiracy to damage national security. His attorneys argued he had acted to prevent catastrophic consequences that the test results had validated. Prosecutors maintained he had violated laws protecting classified information regardless of his motivations. The case became focal point for debates about whistleblower protections and government transparency regarding programs posing existential risks. Lisa Kendrick was not prosecuted criminally, but received administrative punishment that ended her military career. She was separated from service under other than honorable conditions, lost her pension, and was prohibited from holding security clearances in the future. She found work with a non-profit organization advocating for military veterans, using her experience to help others navigate bureaucratic systems that treated unexplained combat trauma as evidence of personal weakness rather than encounters with phenomena beyond conventional understanding. Dr. Sarah Whitman established a research foundation focused on treating personnel who had experienced reality distortions. The 17 survivors recovered from the Arizona facility became her initial patients, though their conditions defied all therapeutic approaches. They existed in states of profound dissociation, aware and responsive at some level, but not accessible through conventional communication methods. Whitman developed alternative techniques using sensory stimulation and electromagnetic field modulation, achieving limited success at helping them navigate back toward normal consciousness. The network continued operating, now publicly acknowledged and substantially expanded. News coverage of the Threshold Initiative disaster had brought attention to a century of suppressed evidence about battlefield reality distortions. Veterans who had experienced the phenomena but never spoken about them came forward with their testimonies. Researchers in multiple disciplines began investigating seriously, no longer constrained by institutional pressure to dismiss unexplained experiences as mere psychological aberrations. The black mist transitioned from suppressed anomaly to recognized phenomenon requiring scientific explanation and appropriate policy responses. Military organizations globally reviewed their policies regarding reality distortions. Training programs were modified to include information about possible encounters with anomalous phenomena during combat operations. Medical protocols were updated to distinguish between conventional combat stress and psychological effects from exposure to altered space-time configurations. Some militaries, learning nothing from the Arizona disaster, continued classified research into weaponizing reality distortions, convinced that success was merely a matter of refined technique and adequate safety measures. The hot zones persisted and expanded. Passchendaele remained anomalous a century after the battle that had first torn reality there. Stalingrad showed persistent effects 8 decades later. New zones continued forming wherever sustained combat concentrated sufficient violence and death. The Arizona facility became the newest addition to a growing list of locations where the fabric of reality had been damaged beyond recovery. Places where doors remained permanently ajar into spaces that should not intersect with human experience. On October 1st, 2025, exactly 108 years after Private Thomas Gillen first encountered the Black Mist, Luc de Vries stood in his field south of Passchendaele village and watched darkness gather in the morning air. It was fog, ordinary autumn fog that rose from the Flanders lowlands every year. But within the fog were textures and movements that suggested something else. Presences that existed in spaces adjacent to the field, separated by barriers grown thin enough that perception could occasionally penetrate. He had farmed this land for 47 years, had grown accustomed to its peculiarities and learned to respect the strangeness that persisted here. His grandfather's warnings about the field being wrong had proven accurate in ways the old man could not have articulated. The ground remembered what had occurred here. The earth held memories of men who had died in quantities sufficient to tear holes in reality, and those holes had never fully healed. The fog thickened. De Vries stood motionless, watching patterns emerge and dissolve, shapes that were almost but not quite recognizable as architecture or machinery or something else for which human languages lacked adequate terminology. He felt the pressure that Professor Andrew Mackenzie had described. Presence without source or direction, awareness that something vast and incomprehensible was very near. Then the fog began to lift. Morning sun burned through from the east. The field returned to ordinary appearance, productive farmland, ready for autumn planting. But De Vries knew what he had witnessed. The door was open here and would remain open, a permanent consequence of what humans had done to this place a century ago. The Black Mist was not history, but ongoing condition, reminder that wars damaged more than lives and infrastructure, that violence concentrated sufficiently tore holes in the fabric of reality that would persist as long as the earth endured. He walked back to his farmhouse, prepared breakfast, began the day's work. Life continued as it always had, humans pursuing their purposes and conflicts, largely unaware that they moved through a reality more fragile and stranger than they imagined. The doors stood open in Passchendaele and Stalingrad and Hughes City and Ramadi and dozens of other locations where humans had concentrated death in quantities sufficient to tear holes in space-time. Through those doors, other spaces waited, patient and eternal, ready for the next war to widen the openings and allow them greater access to the world where humans waged their endless conflicts. The Black Mist persisted. It had always persisted, and it would continue as long as humans made war.